Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar.
Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm Scotty West. This is lesson number 11, so make sure you have your book open to page 11. Well, congratulations, you have finished part 1 of my program, and now it's on to part 2. You know all the basic stuff about the language of music and how it relates to the guitar. Now it's time to dig in and actually learn those 50 pitch patterns that we keep talking about. First, we'll do a quick review of what you need to be practicing at home, and then it's on to the new information. All set? Here we go. Hi, welcome back. Congratulations, you're done with the first part of my program. You know all of the really central things that you have to understand about how the language of music works, and we're going to do a real quick review of all that stuff. Plus, I want to remind you of the stuff that you actually need to be practicing at home, too. Remember, in this show here, we're just giving you the information. It's up to you to actually learn to play the guitar yourself. You should be practicing as often as you can. You should really try to play the instrument at least a little bit every day. Ideally a half an hour or an hour of actually physically playing the instrument. You want to be looking your notes over during the week and reminding yourself of the important facts. Remember, if you ever want to satisfy yourself playing music, you need to know what you're doing. You got to understand it. A lot of people are going to try to tell you that that's not true, but trust me, you really do have to know what you're doing. Otherwise, you'll be like so many other people and you'll just play for a while, but then you'll give it up because you won't really be able to satisfy yourself. Knowing what's going on, understanding music is not very difficult at all, if you ask me. It's really pretty simple as long as they explain it to you in the right order, and that's what I hope I'm doing. I've been working pretty hard on it for a lot of years now, trying to get the order in which, if I explain it to people in that order, then everything makes sense. The very first stuff we learned about music is that music is a language. We don't look at the instrument really as much as you might have expected that we would, because the guitar is just the typewriter. If you don't have the language in your mind, then the typewriter will forever remain a mystery to you. The guitar, you'll never really quite understand how it works. Music is a language. It's also a pretty simple language. It only has 6 parts of speech: pitch, rhythm, timbre, dynamics, technique, and notation. And so you need to memorize those, so at the end of each song you can play, you rattle off that checklist to check yourself out. And you pretty much have to be able to answer yes to all of those 6 different questions, or they're probably going to kick you out of the band and get somebody else who can. Now, pitch is the largest area of music. It's all about the fact that we have these 12 different notes, and that's kind of your alphabet in the language of music. And what we're about to go into in part 2 is we're actually going to be learning these 50 different patterns that we keep talking about. And the 3 main categories are intervals, scales, and chords. You have to learn these 50 patterns, but remember, this is the most important stuff you ever learned from me. There are actually 4 different levels on which you need to know each of these patterns. And this is pretty much just like any word that you know in any language. It would work this way. If you want to claim that you know your language, first of all, you have to be able to think the words. Then you have to be able to read the words. you have to be able to hear the words, recognize them when you hear them, and ultimately you have to be able to turn around and speak the words. In music, this translates into you've got to know your music theory. You've got to know the conceptual stuff about how music works. A lot of people are going to try to tell you you don't, but trust me. Second way, you have to be able to read the words. That means you have to understand at least something about how musical notation works. You'll notice that's what we talked about in the previous 2 lessons, about how to understand standard notation for the guitar and tablature. Most importantly, though, and this is the most important stuff you'll ever learn from anyone on the subject of music, if you ask me, in any language, the most important way that you have to recognize your patterns is you have to be able to recognize them when you hear them. This is the whole world of playing by ear. But a lot of people don't really understand that the real way that musicians play by ear is they go through a program of ear training. And not very many people have actually heard of ear training, but it is the 2 most important words you'll ever hear me say. The third part of my program involves ear training, and we'll be to that in a few hours. Finally, in the end, the fourth way you have to know your patterns is you have to be able to speak. And I always suggest that you use some kind of machine to speak in the musical language. And so that on the guitar, that translates into knowing your finger patterns. Too many people believe that this is all there is to playing the guitar, is learning how to move your fingers around on this mysterious machine. But that would be just like typing on the typewriter without really knowing what you want to say or anything like that. That's all there is to understanding about music. It's a language. It has 6 parts of speech. Pitch is the most complicated one. After that, we simply went on to figuring out how the guitar actually works. And we learned the musical alphabet here. A through G with all the sharps and flats, no sharps and flats between B and C and E and F. Then the fascinating thing we went on to after that is, why is the guitar tuned E, A, D, G, B, E? Everybody knows that, but not very many people know why. Of course, the answer is because you have 4 fingers. If you look at the musical alphabet, you will see that there's always 4 notes. For example, in between E and A, there's 4 notes. In between A and D, in between D and G. Remember, between G and B, there's only 3 notes because they discovered if they made that one little change in how the instrument was tuned, that it made a whole lot of finger patterns more possible that would have previously been impossible before. Finally, back to B and E up here at the top. Remember, it's 2 full octaves from your low E string to your high E string. You can see there's your progression of notes. Up like that. So 4 fingers equals 4 frets. And one of the main things that you've got to be practicing at this point, one of the main physical skills that you need to be working on, is developing your ability to control those 4 frets with your 4 fingers. The one exercise we've given you so far to do that with is that chromatic scale exercise, where you're playing all 12 notes up through all of your strings, and so valuable. I don't give people a lot of finger exercises to do. I just figure for now anyway, that's the king of them all. And the more you can get those 4 fingers limbered up and coordinate that with your down-up picking with your other hand, that's what it is to play the guitar. Now, yes, 4 fingers equals 4 frets, but remember, it actually requires the control of 5 frets to really control the 12-note system on the guitar. When we're down at the bottom of the neck, we can use the open string as that 5th note. Further up the neck, though, you can't. The open string is too far away to be any use to you, so you learn to do your finger shifts, where going up the scale, you reach out to get that extra note with your index finger, and coming down the scale, you can reach out with your pinky and get those notes. You'll also, another thing you're going to be wanting to work on over time is memorizing your fretboard, all the alphabet letters on all the frets, on all the strings of your fretboard. Up here. So the main physical thing you're practicing at this point is your chromatic scales, both down at the bottom of the neck and with finger shifts up anywhere else, all the way up to the top of the neck. Next thing we did is we learned some basic facts about chords. There's 45 different types of chords. There's 12 of any type. There's only 5 basic possible finger forms, but that means if you understand how bar chords work, there's actually 5 ways to play any chord. All chords have their root note, and we put a little R over here over the root note in each one of these 5 forms over here. The other big thing that you need to be practicing at this point is you need to learn all of these chord shapes. Every single one, no matter what style of music you're interested in, over the next 5, 3, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, you're going to bump into every single one of these chord shapes. And remember, this is just a stripped down popular music lesson plan here. And no matter what style, from country to heavy metal, you're going to be bumping into all of these at some point. So make sure you learn all these. You also have to learn them as bar chords, too. And that's going to take some time. You're going to have to practice these quite a bit for a year or two before you build up the strength and coordination in your hands to actually be able to play bar chords well. But it's an absolutely essential part of playing the guitar. Finally, the other thing you need to practice about these chords is you need to be able to get there in about a half a second. Not only do you have to be able to play these chords and have all the notes come out cleanly, you've got about a half a second to get your fingers, even to these big, ugly, difficult bar chords. You need to get there in a split second. So you might look back and review that methodology that we learned about how to practice chords, using a beat-keeping machine and counting in fours, switching back and forth between two different of these chords, practicing chords in pairs. That's all such important stuff. So those are the two physical things that you're practicing so far: your chromatic scales, and you've got to master all of these different chord shapes. And you need to work at these a little bit every day. I can't help you with that. I'm out here in TV land, but you need to work on that yourself at home. And the faster you can make the progress, the faster you will be on to having fun and playing the songs that you like. The next thing that we looked at was this all-important musical number system. Remember, the musical number system is an alternative way of assigning names to the 12 notes in our pitch system that treat music as if there's only one key to play in instead of 12. Remember, there are 12 notes, so that means that there's 12 different keys to play in. So if you were to take one of those pitch patterns, for example, a major chord, if you were going to memorize a major chord in all 12 keys using the alphabet system for naming the notes, you would have 12 different sets of alphabet letters that you would have to memorize. The beauty of the number system is, since it treats music like there is only one key to play in, there is only one number pattern that you have to remember for each chord. For example, yes, there's 12 different major chords, but they are always 1, 3, 5 in whatever key you're in. And that's what lines you right up with the slide rule and how the slide rule works, so that you can figure out the spellings of these patterns, which might ultimately allow you to actually figure out where to put your fingers instead of always needing somebody to show you where to put your fingers. That's a really powerful place to be, if you can actually think on your instrument and figure out your finger patterns for yourself. It's a very doable thing. How does the number system work? Well, it numbers all 12 notes, all 13 notes in an octave, but it doesn't assign each one of those notes a whole number. Remember, it just assigns the notes in that all-important pattern, the do-re-mi scale, the major diatonic scale, which is a sequence of intervals that goes whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Or in other words, mostly whole steps except between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. And that's where you produce that sound that we know as a do-re-mi scale, a major diatonic scale. So some of the review questions, you could think about this for a minute. You can even pause the tape if you want. Are things like, okay, what number note is a whole step above 5? And of course the answer would be 6, because 5 and 6 are a whole step apart. One of my trickier questions is, okay, what's the note that's a whole step above 3? And everybody goes, 4? And I go, no, remember, there's only a half step between 3 and 4. So the actual note that's a whole step above 3 is actually that note right there. Down here, that would mean that that's sharp 4 or flat 5 is a whole step above 3. Notes like 9, 10, and 11 are just up in the next octave, or at least that's the way you want to think about it for now. 8, after all, is the same as 1. They were both do, weren't they? And 9 is the same as 2. It's a whole step above 8. 10 and 11 are only a half step apart because they're the same as 3 and 4. That's how the musical number system works. If you have any questions about that, make sure you go back and look at that tape again. Look at your booklet, the pages in your booklet that cover that subject. Now, what we did a couple of hours ago was interesting fact about where this whole 12-note system came from, and how this relates to the pitch system that we use in modern music. And So pitch is a continuum. There's an infinite number of pitches. Where did this 12-note system come from? Well, interestingly enough, as you recall, excuse me, those funny little finger tricks that you learned on the neck of the guitar called harmonics that occur at the 12th fret and the 7th fret and the 5th fret. Everybody thinks those are funny little tricks that the guitar does, but remember, they're actually a rather profound thing. They led to the creation of the whole 12-note system. I don't really care whether you remember any of that stuff or not. What are the number notes that are produced by the loudest harmonics at the 12th, the 7th, and the 5th fret? Well, they are the notes 1, 5, 8. And as we suggested, that is the entire history of music right there. And those are what I always refer to as the 3 most important notes in all of music. And the 12-note system kind of evolved out of that. So many different levels of music, you're going to see that stuff. And including the final thing about that is, remember, once we discovered our first 3 notes, we also discovered our first 3 intervals, which are the distances between the notes. So the distance from note number 1 to note number 5, the distance from 5 up to 8, and then, of course, the distance from 1 all the way up to 8. That, as you know, is an octave. We're going to be heavily into intervals in the next hour from now, but for now, you can just remember that the distance from note number 1 to note number 5 is called a fifth. It's actually called a perfect fifth, and the distance from 5 to 8 is a fourth, because the distance from 5 to 8 is the same as the distance from 1 to 4. Turns out to be 5 half steps, and that is an interval of a perfect fourth. We will be, as I said, we'll be talking about intervals more next time. The next 2 hours, we're not going to look at that again. You'll need to go back and review your tapes again. But the last 2 hours were all about musical notation. And as I mentioned in those shows, that I don't really have the time to show you every last thing about how musical notation works, but that was a pretty good basic look at how standard notation and tablature works. If you're going to pursue the notational aspects of playing the guitar, you're going to need to find yourself a private teacher. You're going to need to get into the exercise books and just have at it and just keep going. And again, you need to practice that stuff every day. Well, that is, as I said before, that is the end of part 1 of my program. You know all of the basic things about how the language of music works. Now it's time for us to go on to part 2 of my program. And this is where we're going to learn these actual 50 different pitch patterns that we keep talking about. Now that you know the basic stuff about music, it's time to acquire a vocabulary in this language, and that involves learning those 50 pitch patterns. And remember, ultimately you have to learn each one of these pitch patterns 4 different ways. You got to know your theory. You got to recognize them on paper as notation. You've got to, most importantly, train your ears to recognize them. And finally, you have to be able to move your fingers on the instrument in order to be able to play them. So here we go, part 2 of my program, the 50 pitch patterns. And this whole section I call the 6 levels of pitch theory. Now, why is the word pitch theory here? Because this is the part where we're actually going to learn our 50 different pitch patterns. Why are we talking about these 6 different levels? Well, because the way we're going to learn these pitch patterns is we're going to investigate them in order of complexity. That is, we're going to start with the absolute simplest patterns of pitch, and we're going to work our way up to the most complex ones in 6 different increments. So, this is 50 different pitch patterns in order of complexity. We are going to get through the first 2 levels of complexity today because they're so simple there isn't an awful lot to know about them. But after that it starts to bog down a bit, and as we get to level number 3 we're going to be on that subject for a couple of hours, and when we get to level 4 we're going to be on that subject for like 5 hours probably to get all the way through that. But we're starting real simple today, and I should confess that what we're going to talk about right now is kind of like my own peculiar way of teaching music. This is not something that they're apt to mention to you in conventional, say, college level music theory course, but I think you'll find this very illuminating. It's just a little bit different take on it, and we're learning these pitch patterns in order of complexity. So here we go. And when I used to ask people, I said, "What do you think are the simplest pitch patterns in music?" I would get a lot of funny answers of actually pitch patterns that were considerably further along on the scale in the 6 different increments that we're going to be looking at these in. For example, people will say, I go, "What are the simplest pitch patterns?" And they go, "Scales?" And I go, "Actually, no, scales are rather complex patterns. They're actually level number 4 in my 6 levels of pitch theory. We're going to go 3 levels of simplicity below that, and down to where most people have just take this stuff for granted and never really thought about this at all. We're going to start here with number 1. And I am going to suggest that the absolute simplest pitch patterns in music are so simple that there isn't anything there yet at all. And I'm going to suggest that the first level of complexity in music is silence. How do you like that? Now, you probably weren't expecting that at all. The first level of complexity in music is silence. If you think about it, where would music be without silence? This is a symbol that I draw here often, is that yin-yang business. Because we're looking at opposites here, aren't we? We're looking at the dark and the light. We're looking at the positive and the negative pole of the battery. They say the universe couldn't exist without matter and antimatter. You can't have noise without silence. You know what I mean? The electrical battery has the positive and negative pole. And not only that, you're going to come to realize that silence is an integral part of all I won't say quite all, but most of the music we play. Like Beethoven's Fifth. Dun 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 dun. Dun 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 dun. That little bit of silence in between those 2 musical phrases was just as much a part of that piece as any of the noise you made. So, just like the universe can't exist without matter and antimatter, music can't exist without noise and anti-noise. Another way to kind of look at this is to understand that silence is kind of the canvas on which you paint music. If you know anything about the visual arts, like about drawing or painting, you know that unless you're trying to do some weird thing, you generally don't paint white paint on a white canvas. You wouldn't really see anything at all. You paint blue paint or black paint or red paint or whatever on a white canvas. The white is like the background. It's like the ground that you start everything on. And and in your final composition, you might have certain bits of that white background still showing through in your picture. One of the most famous quotes in art education, and I learned this when I went to visual arts school, but I think it applies equally well to music. I don't know who originally said this, but a very interesting phrase is that contrast is the first rule of art. If you're talking sculpture, you're talking about positive space and the negative space that surrounds the object that you're carving. In painting, it's the contrast of the color of the paint that you paint on the canvas, which is the white background, and out of that the forms emerge. And exactly the same thing is true in music. Silence is the canvas on which you paint the music, and it is the contrast between the noise and the anti-noise that actually forms the composition itself. Well, how do you like that? Not an awful lot more to be said about it than that. We're saying that we're studying these pitch patterns in order of complexity, and there you go. That's the simplest pattern of pitch. Everything is so simple that there isn't even anything there yet at all, and therefore there isn't an awful lot to learn about it either. And so, that's it right there. But just keep that in the back of your mind, that where would music be without silence? So, how do you like that? We've gotten through our first level already, just in a few minutes. On to level 2. Remember, we're learning our 50 different pitch patterns in order of complexity. Silence was the first level. We are now on to level number 2. After silence, what is the next most complex patterns of pitch? Well, in my way of thinking about it, the next most complex patterns of pitch is this. You had your silence. Up out of the silence erupts one note. This is the level of what I call the note, and this is level number 2. The note. Now, again, this is my own kind of esoteric way of teaching music. You're not going to find that there's any songs out there that just contain one note. As I'm sure you know, any piece you play has a bunch of different notes kind of swirling through the song, and but what I'm going to suggest in a moment is in any piece of conventional music, even though that piece has a bunch of different notes in it, somewhere in that piece there is always one note that is acting as the anchor for the whole thing. It's what I call the nucleus note, and we'll talk a bit about that more in a moment. But another thing we should probably just remind ourselves about when we're talking about this level right here of the note is we should remind ourselves maybe of what a musical note is at all. Or it's a pitch. On the guitar, you have plucked one of the strings on your guitar and you've caused it to vibrate, and that string vibrating sends out sound waves through the air. And remember, we talked about the frequency of the sound wave. That is how far apart the actual waves are from one another. These sound waves travel through the room or through the atmosphere, and they bump into your eardrum and cause your eardrum to vibrate at a particular rate. And that sends a signal to your brain, and that's what we humans call pitch. So that's just to remind ourselves of what a note is. It's actually an experience that we have of how high or how low the frequency of the sound wave is, and therefore how the pitch actually manifests itself to us of the note. But now on to this other subject, as I mentioned before. There is no music that just has one note in it. At least none that I'm aware of. There might be some strange thing out there somewhere that I don't know about. But as you know, all of the music you've ever heard has a bunch of different swirling notes in it. They're all forming themselves into linear single note patterns that we call melodies. They are stacking on top of each other in vertical arrangements that we refer to as harmony or as chords and stuff like that. So no songs just have one note in them. But another one of the cornerstones of conventional music is to understand that in any even remotely conventional piece of modern music, or music from any period actually, even though there's this swirling mass of notes in there, there is always one note that's acting as the anchor. It's acting as what I call the nucleus note for the piece right there. And this is one of your first great intellectual challenges to understand about music. It also turns out to be one of your first great ear training challenges. You need to be able to listen to a song. You need to be able to listen to chords and scales and actually be able to determine where that nucleus note actually is. Remember, there is 12 notes in our pitch system, and any one of those 12 notes could be acting as the nucleus note. That is one of the things that tells us that there are 12 different keys that you can play in music. So, the real subject that we're talking about right here, we reminded ourselves of what a musical pitch is all about, but another one of the things you've got to keep in your mind all the time about conventional music is there is always, I'm going to write the word always, but I'll also mention that actually in more sophisticated styles of music, there are moments known as unresolved harmonies where there isn't an obvious central nucleus note. But I doubt that you're necessarily listening to very much of that stuff at this point. We will in fact talk about that much later in the program, about a bit about unresolved harmonies. But for the most part, in popular music, there is always a nucleus note. I use the word nucleus purposefully because it really isn't an official musical term, is it? In a moment, in this box down here, we are going to be filling in a lot of the conventional terms that we use to describe this phenomenon, but I think it's kind of good to introduce it up here as almost being outside of the realm of music. And I use the word nucleus also because I tend to view conventional pieces of music, metaphorically speaking, as kind of like almost like a solar system. In the center of the solar system, of course, we have the sun. And metaphorically speaking, this is the note. Out of your 12 notes, you have chosen one of those notes to be the actual center of the piece right there. Once you have done that you've chosen one of those 12 notes to be that nucleus note, that has an awful lot to do with the concept of playing in a particular key. And we have mentioned that there are actually 12 keys that you can play on. Later, you're going to find out there's minor keys and modal keys and things like that. But for right now, the way to look at it is there are 12 different keys because there are 12 different notes from which you have a choice of figuring out which that nucleus note is going to be. Let's say for our purposes right now that we've decided that C is going to be our nucleus note. What that means is we are in the key of C. And as I mentioned a moment ago, what we're going to do in this box over here is this being one of the central concepts in music. Over the years, over the centuries, several different terms, several different words have been coined. Several different terms have arisen to describe this nucleus note phenomenon. And many times people hear all of these different words and they don't understand that these are all just different ways of expressing the same concept. And it's another one of these things that makes people think that music is more complicated than it actually is. You're going to find out that all these different words are just different ways of saying the same thing, in a sense. Slightly different contexts, different styles of music. People tend to use different lingo, but certainly, one of the first words, then, that we want to learn to associate with the concept of this nucleus note is, as we mentioned a moment ago, whenever you're talking about what key you're in. That certainly is one word that relates to the note. If somebody says to you, hey, what key are we in? And you go, well, we're in the key of C. What that means, it means a bunch of stuff that we'll be talking about as we go through the program. But one of the main things it means is that we have chosen, out of the 12 notes, we have chosen C to be that nucleus note for that particular moment in that particular piece. The interesting thing is, once you have determined what key a particular piece of music is in, you've actually started to unlock the puzzle, the kind of the puzzle box that is the entire piece. What you're going to find out is, and a lot of people hate to hear this, but most popular music is far more similar to other types of pop music than it is dissimilar to other styles of music. And once you understand that, you see that really there isn't an awful lot of difference between these different styles of music. I'm fond of saying the difference between punk rock and nursery rhymes is hardly worth mentioning. People go, what? Are you kidding? Nursery rhymes and punk rock? And I go, yeah. In terms of their actual structure, the types of chords and chord progressions that we use in there, the way the melodies work in many cases, the only difference is like attitude. You know what I mean? Attitude and timbre. You've got distorted electric guitars, which you don't hear in nursery rhymes too much. You've got the guy is screaming, the vocals out, and the drums are pounding. But otherwise, the underlying structure of the pieces are actually very similar. I'm oversimplifying a bit, but once you have figured out what key a song is in, you can actually get to the point where you can actually make predictions about what else is going to be going on in that song, particularly about what chords are going to show up in that song and stuff like that. So, as we said before, I kind of tend to look at this nucleus note phenomenon down here like it's that's what key you're in. That's the central note. But you're also going to find out that once you've determined what key a piece is in, that tells you a lot about, you can make predictions about what other notes are going to show up in a piece if you know what key it's in, because these are very conventional relationships that we're going to be learning about. These are kind of like the planets that are orbiting around that nucleus note down there. Now, I'm not going to explain to you how I know this right now because we're not ready to do that yet. But for example, if I knew that I was in the key of C, some of the other notes that I might predict would actually be cycling around there would be F and G and A. We'll be talking in the next couple of hours of how I know that, but you could just trust me for now. If I was in some other key, I would know what other alphabet letters to fill in those 3 boxes right there. For those of you who know something about chord progressions already, you might recognize that the relationship between C, F, and G is a 1-4-5 progression. If you look on your slide rule down on the scale side, over on this side over here, you don't really have to look at this on camera, about 2/3 of the way down the left side of the page, you'll see it says common progression. That's a 1-4-5 progression. If you set your slide rule up so that C is in that first box there, you'll see that F and G wind up in the windows that are 4 and 5. 1-4-5 progression is probably the most common chord progression in all styles of popular music. So if I know that 1 is C, I can predict that an F and a G will probably be in there as well because that's 4 and 5. A turns out to be the 6, and I won't confuse you with that right now. We need to understand more about what's called diatonic harmony, which we'll be into in a couple of hours in order to see that. So these other notes here are kind of like planets that are orbiting around this central note, the sun down here in our song. But these just represent the root notes of additional chords that might be in the song. And of course, each one of those chords has additional notes in it besides its root note. I tend to think of these as like little moons that are orbiting around each of these planets that are ultimately all orbiting around the sun. For example, an F chord has an A and a C in it. So these are very predictable relationships that I know something about. A G chord has a B and a D in it. So I can predict that I would see those notes orbiting around the G. An A minor chord, which the 6th chord would be a minor chord, don't worry about that for now, would have a C and an E around it too. So if I can just figure out which of the 12 notes is acting as the nucleus note at any particular point in time, I can make some very logical and educated predictions about what else is going to be showing up in that song. The cool thing about that is, as we've mentioned right from day one, you're going to want to get, if particularly in the world of pop music, you're going to want to get to the point where you can figure out songs by ear. That is, you're going to want to be able to figure out songs just by listening to them. And a cool thing to realize is, if you understand your music theory, that will help you figure out songs by ear. Because in the beginning, at least, you don't have to rely completely on your ears to figure out songs. If you know about the conventional structures in music, you can use that to actually predict what songs are likely to be in there. You can figure out what key you're in. You can grab your slide rule and mess around with this in ways that we haven't looked at yet, and it'll pretty much tell you what other notes and other relationships are apt to show up in that song. Isn't that cool? Music is a totally knowable and understandable phenomenon, and that's an exciting thing to realize. As we've said so many times before, in everything, but particularly in art, knowledge is power, and the more you know about it, the more it sets you free to express yourself and to satisfy yourself playing music. So, this nucleus note phenomenon, since it's such a huge subject in music, over the years, a lot of different terms have arisen to describe this phenomenon, and the first one we wrote down here is the whole concept of key. When you tell somebody that you're in the key of A, or in the key of D, or in the key of F, or in the key of B flat, you are telling them which of the 12 notes is functioning as that nucleus note in that piece. You're going to learn later on that a piece doesn't always stay in the same key all the way through the song, but an awful lot of music does. Maybe as much as 50% of the music you've ever heard just remains, for all intents and purposes, centered around one nucleus note, and that is what the whole concept of key is all about. Well, let's look at some of the other concepts and some of the other words that we need to learn to associate with this nucleus note phenomenon. For example, when we were talking about chords, we mentioned that all chords have a nucleus note too. We called that the root note of the chord. You're also going to find out that scales have root notes as well too. So certainly another word that we want to learn to associate with this nucleus note phenomenon is the whole concept of the root note, which we've already mentioned in the context of chords, and we will be talking about it in terms of scales too. All scales have a root note. I think in a way it's fair to say that all conventional songs have a root note. There's one note in that song that's acting as the nucleus that's holding the whole thing together. A couple of other words that we're going to learn to associate with this phenomenon are other words that we've bumped into. We just mentioned a moment ago that all scales have roots. What do we call the root notes of a particular scale? Well, one thing we know is in that solfeggio system, we call note number 1, we call the first note of the scale, we call it do. So anytime you're basically talking about do, you're talking about the root note of that scale. We also learned to look at the structure of chords and scales from the point of view of the musical number system. So in the musical number system, the root note, the nucleus note, is note number 1. So whenever you're thinking about note number 1, that's the root note as well. Now, of course, that also means that note number 8 is the root note as well, because remember, note number 8 is just the octave note of note number 1. They're the same alphabet letter. So if 1 is C, then 8 is C as well. It's an octave above note number 1. So the key that you're in, the root note, do, 1, note number 8, these are all different ways in different contexts of talking about this nucleus note. All of these particular words you have heard before. You've heard them in this program, as a matter of fact. The next one I'm going to write down is one that you might not have heard of so much up till now. You might have heard of this word in other sources, other contexts and stuff, and never quite knew what it meant. I'm going to put a circle around this one because this is a particularly important one to know, even though that we haven't mentioned it before now. Another word that you want to learn to associate with the nucleus note in any pitch pattern or any song is, you want to know it as the tonic. Like I said, this is a word that we might not have used before, but this is an important one to know because this is kind of like the official musical term for it. This is what they refer to it in the textbooks, and if you were to go to music school and stuff like that. This is left over kind of from classical music theory and stuff like that. The tonic note is the note that is the central note. It's the nucleus note in the piece or in the pitch pattern at any particular time. And so even if you're going, why do I have to learn these official terms? And remember, I go, if I do my job right, you're going to be looking at Guitar Player magazine and you're probably going to be buying some books and looking through them. This is the official term that they use in the books, so make sure you learn to associate the word tonic with the nucleus note too. Now, a couple of other words that we're going to write in here as well are a little bit off-center. They aren't quite as central words to associate with this phenomenon as we might think. But certainly one other word that has to do with this nucleus note phenomenon is the concept of the fundamental. Now, this really has more to do with harmonics and stuff like that, but there is always and you can see why that might apply to that nucleus note, the fundamental. It's the foundation note of what's going on at that moment, the fundamental. It's a little not quite so much involved in song structure, more involved in the relationship between pitch and timbre and the overtone series and stuff like that. But the fundamental is, for example, the loudest harmonic and in a particular timbre, and so you want to learn to associate that word with it. Another word that's also related to this whole phenomenon is the whole concept of resolution. This involves harmony. This involves chords and chord progressions and things like that. It is said that harmony always has its point of resolution, and that is if I play a particular harmonic set of notes, I have obviously more than one note in this pile of notes. I'm playing 4 different notes right here. But it is said that this particular harmonic arrangement will always have its point of resolution. And where does it resolve to? Where does that harmony resolve to? It resolves to its root note. And you can go through a chord progression, but ultimately the thing will always resolve back to its point of resolution, to its root note. In conventional music, there is some music that doesn't work that way. But to investigate these structures in music, a lot of times you just have to start off with these really basic, simple types of concepts and try to get your mind around those. And then over time, you'll learn that many of the great songwriters and great composers over the centuries have figured out ways of twisting or downright breaking these various rules. Not really rules, I don't like to use that word, but certainly they're exploring new ways of investigating harmony and melody and things like that. But resolution is another important concept in music, about how harmony always resolves to a particular resolution, point of resolution. Okay, cool. As we mentioned before, this level number 2, remember our first level is silence, pitch patterns that are so simple there isn't even anything there yet at all. The second level of complexity is out of the silence erupts one note. We call it the level of the note. And we reminded ourselves of what a musical pitch, a musical note was, but we also said that the more pertinent thing that you want to remember about the concept of the note is that in any piece of conventional music there is always a nucleus note, and we know that note by a variety of different names. You'll want to memorize all these different names so that when you see them in the books or the magazines, you won't be confused about what they're about. As we said, this is one of your great intellectual challenges in music, and one of the cool things is if you understand what key you're in, and so therefore which note is functioning as the tonic, you can make some very intelligent predictions using your slide rule and eventually your memory. Hopefully you'll memorize all this stuff that will actually allow you to predict what other things are going to be happening in that song, and that goes a long way towards augmenting your ear's ability to figure out songs by ear. And what do I mean by that? Well, one of the first things we're going to do when we get to the ear training section of this program is we're going to throw a bunch of chords at you, and as we said, ear training is all about singing. We're going to throw chords at you, and my challenge to you is to have you sing the note for me that you believe is that nucleus note of the chord, that tonic note. For example, I play this chord for you, and my question is, where, by ear, where is the nucleus note of that chord? And hopefully you'll be able to go, my ear tells me that pitch is the actual nucleus note of that chord that I'm playing. Here's another chord. That note right there, or the octave note below it. The two notes that I'm singing are an octave apart, but they are both the root note of this chord. This is a G major chord, so the note that I'm singing is a G note. If you look right there, you can see that key is labeled G right there. Now here's a minor chord. Here's a sad-sounding minor chord. And I listen to that and I can tell that the root note there is doesn't that sound like the central note? Doesn't that sound like the note that all of the notes in that pattern resolve to? Here's the note that's an octave higher than that too. So not only do you have to learn this concept of the nucleus note as a concept, you also have to eventually get to where you've trained your ears to be able to listen to it and pick it out when you hear it, too. It's easier than a lot of people think. People go, geez, will I ever be able to do that? And I go, in my experience of 15 years teaching now and probably over 1,000 students, most people can do that. I've had a small percentage, a tiny percentage of people. As a matter of fact, I've really only had, out of that 1,000 students, I've really only had maybe 10 that just didn't seem as though they were ever going to get the hang of it. Everybody else, they range from people that can just walk in the door the first day and any chord I play, they can hum the root note, to people that need to work at it for a while. For the first couple of hours of ear training, they might start at like getting 50% right and 50% wrong, and then we work our way up to where they're doing 75%, and finally we get up to where, for all intents and purposes, they're doing 100%. Anytime I play a chord, they can hum the root note for me. So, there you go. That's it right there. It's not only one of your great intellectual challenges to figure out which note is functioning as the nucleus note, it's also one of your first great ear training challenges as well. Okay, that's about all there is to be said about that for now, too. And it is time for us to go on to number 3 of the 6 levels of pitch theory. Now, isn't this interesting? We've gone essentially screaming through the first 2 levels right in our first hour here. Well, this is where things are going to start to bog down a little. This is where things are going to get complex enough that you're going to have some work to do. I have a lot to tell you about these following subjects after here. But also, you're going to need to do some work of your own, memorizing facts about how these more complex patterns work. And let me suggest now that the first level of complexity in music is silence. The second level of complexity in music, up out of the silence erupts one note, so that's the level of the note. Now, what would be the next most complex patterns of pitch? Well, let me suggest that after there was no notes and after there was one note, maybe the next most complex patterns involve 2 notes and the relationship between those 2 notes. This, of course, as we might have mentioned several times before, well, actually, let me get to that in a second. When you're talking about patterns that involve 2 notes, strictly speaking, these are what are known as dyads. You're also going to find out that patterns that involve 3 notes are called triads, but patterns that involve 2 notes are called dyads. So that's an important thing to know. But actually, we're going to use level number 3 to talk about a even more important subject than that. And as a matter of fact, I've been known to say that this next word that we're going to write down is the most important word in music theory. Remember, ear training is the most important word in music, but specifically under the subject of music theory, this third concept down here might be the most important one at all. And we've already mentioned this a few times. Take a moment and see if you can think of what that is. What we're going to be talking about is pitch patterns that involve 2 notes. And what that also implies is that there's some kind of pitch relationship between these 2 notes. If I play 2 notes, those 2 notes are a particular distance apart from one another, aren't they? Here's 2 notes that are actually quite close together. When I go from one note to the note right next to it, you might recall that that's called a half step. Now here's 2 notes that are further apart. They're actually quite far apart. Whenever we talk about 2 notes and the relationship between them, what very important word in music are we talking about? Do you remember? We talked a lot about this when we were talking about the musical number system and the major scale. This is the huge subject of intervals. This could be the most important word in all of music theory, because what you're going to find out is that all of the more complex patterns in music, including whole songs, are all made up of intervals. And people go, really? I thought they were made up of notes. I thought when you're talking about songs, that songs are made up of notes. And I go, actually, they are. If we look at our slide rule here, as a matter of fact, let's try to zoom in on this at this point. And yes, when I have the chord side of the slide rule set up here now. And certainly, whenever we're talking about forming chords, we know that these things are words that are spelled out of the musical alphabet. So, for example, here's a major chord, a major triad, and we see that it's spelled C-E-G. And over here, here's an augmented triad, which is C-E and G sharp. And we have all these different chords all over this slide rule here that we can look at, and they all have particular spellings. So, yes, these patterns are made up of notes. But remember this, if you're looking at these as being patterns of notes, the actual alphabet letters that make up these patterns is going to change depending on what key you're playing in. A major chord is not always C-E-G. It's only C-E-G when you're in the key of C. But when you're in the key of F, it represents totally different alphabet letters for the spelling of that particular pattern. So, yes, even though these patterns are all made up of notes, another significant thing that you would want to understand is that if we remove the concept of playing in a particular key, then we can kind of remove this entire section, this entire middle section here from the slide rule, and we can just look at this part of the slide rule here and really notice that really what constitutes these various patterns is not the actual notes that they're made of, but what the spacing between the notes is all about. And you'll notice that in these different patterns there are lots of different types of spacing involved. These two notes in this major 6 pattern are actually relatively close together, whereas take a look down here at this add 9 chord, and we have notes that are spaced very far apart in these patterns. This whole side of the slide rule is dedicated to chords. If we flip the slide rule over, this whole side of the slide rule over here is dedicated to scales. And you can make some generalizations about these various patterns. For example, if you look at these, you'll notice that the distances between the notes in scales, as a general rule, these notes are much closer together, consistently closer together than they are when you look at chords. In chords, you have these larger distances between the notes. Now, some chords have some relatively small intervals in them as well, but as a general rule, you can say that the notes in chords are spaced further apart than the notes in chords are. The notes in scales are. And that's what I'm talking about when I say that possibly intervals is the most important word in all of music theory, because all of these more complex patterns, yes, they're made of notes, but what's almost more significant to know is what the spacing of the notes is between them. And that, of course, is the whole hugely important subject of intervals. Now, we are just going to scratch the surface of intervals. Our next 2 lessons are going to be about intervals and related subjects, and also, of course, how to play them on the guitar. This, as I say, is where the work really begins, because starting with level number 3 here, I'm going to suggest that this is where our list of 50 pitch patterns really begins to evolve from, and you're going to have a bunch of memorization to do on these various subjects. And in fact, I'm fond of saying that if you want to claim that you've mastered any one of these particular levels of the 6 levels of theory as we go on from here, there are actually 6 things to do to claim that you've mastered each one of these levels. And that's what we're going to start off again with next time. We're going to look at the 6 different ways that you actually have to understand your intervals. There are 13 different intervals that we're going to talk about initially, and that's what we're going to do next time. I'm sure you're going to find it fascinating. Well, anyway, that's all the time we've got for today. Learned a lot of interesting stuff again today. Maybe it wasn't exactly what you were expecting again, but like I say, later on, when you are the only one in the band who really knows what's going on, you'll thank yourself later on. So, for now, we'll say goodbye. I'm Scotty West. Make sure you're looking over your notes and memorizing your stuff, and we'll see you again next week for another fascinating installment of Absolutely Understand Guitar. Okay, we'll see you. Bye-bye.